I mean, I started making music a long, long time ago. When I was very young, I played classical music and I studied music theory, and then I played in punk rock bands. And then in the mid 80s, I started getting interested in electronic music. And essentially what's happened from when I started making records, which was about 1989, 1990, is making records has become a lot easier. Distributing records has become easier. Like every aspect of it that used to be so difficult is now effortless. Just to get to the point where you had a finished piece of electronic music took a long time, a lot of money, a lot of effort, and a lot of understanding of how all these pieces of equipment worked with each other. And now it's software, you know? So now any kid can use a cracked version or buy a version of Reason or Logic or Ableton, and in about 5 minutes do what took 6 months or years 20 years ago. What's interesting is in the olden days of 30, 40, 50 years ago, people didn't make things. You know, like, so people would go to photography exhibits, people would go buy records, and there were professional artists. And now everybody's a photographer, everybody's a filmmaker, everybody's a writer, everybody's a musician. And I think that radically and drastically changes the way people think about other people's creativity. Because in the old days, you would buy a record and think like, whoa, these people who made the record, I have no idea how they did that. And now someone listens to music and they think to themselves, oh, they use the same software I have. And so it almost makes people focus more on the art as opposed to the artist and the means and the ways in which it's produced, which I personally think is quite healthy. Well, it's almost, I think that in a way culturally, and this is potentially dangerous, is we're sacrificing rare creativity that has depth for ubiquitous creativity that's very shallow. You know, like letters versus emails. You know, a letter was rare, but people would tend to write quite a lot. Emails are ubiquitous, and they tend to just be 10, 20 words. It's the same thing with like a piece of music 30 years ago. Someone might work on it for 6 months and really struggle, and it was rare and perhaps had depth, whereas now someone can make an okay sounding piece of music in 30 minutes and might not have as much depth. Because if you can make something that's pretty good with not a lot of effort, it's hard to push yourself to make something great. In a way, the demise of the record business has brought about two things. One, the complete rise of crass commercialism. And also, it's also brought about a sense of purity. You know, like as a musician, you're confronted with two choices, which is sell out as much as you can to try and make a little bit of money, or recognize that there's not that much money to be made and hold on to artistic purity. Like in the old days, 10 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, a record company could come to a musician and say, if you sell out, you'll sell 2 million records. And the musician might think, oh, okay, that's okay. Now the record company goes to the musician and says, if you sell out even more, you'll sell 10,000 records. So I think a lot of musicians are saying, well, there's no incentive to accommodate the record company. There's no incentive to bend over backwards and sell out. So why not just approach things for the love of creativity? So I think that world of like online communication, of blogging and tweetering and or tweeting, and I do it because I like communicating. I think some musicians do it because they have managers and handlers who tell them that that's the way of, I don't know, staying relevant in this world. You know, at the end of the day, as long as people make music that affects other people emotionally, I know this sounds like an oversimplification, but I think things will be okay. I think it's very strange. In the last 10 or 12 or 15 years, I've had so many conversations with people in the music business about what's going, like the digital revolution. And all the conversations, I just sit back and listen. And for the most part, people just talk about like how to new digital delivery streams or proprietary this or ways of increasing revenue streams. And whenever anyone talks about the future of the record company, they talk about the delivery vehicles or new marketing strategies. I've never once heard anyone in the music business talk about the future of the music business being making better records. No one has ever mentioned that. Everyone talks about the digital side of it. And I was like, why don't you sign interesting artists and have them make nice music? And when I've mentioned that to people in the record business, they just look confused. Because for the longest time, it almost like the record companies wanted to fool the public. And it was all about smoke and mirrors and deceit and getting people to buy CDs that were really bad. And so I feel like a lot of the content providers feel like they have to fool people into spending money for content. At the end of the day, make a beautiful movie, write a beautiful book, make a great record, and people are probably willing to pay for it. They might not be willing to make the musician rich and worth $500 million, but people in general, I think, are willing to pay for art and culture that they truly love. It doesn't matter how it's delivered, it doesn't matter how it's marketed, it doesn't matter how it's sold. It just matters how that art or music affects the person who's experiencing it. It's, to me, understanding or trying to make a living out of monetizing digital creativity is like building a hotel on quicksand. You know, like no matter what you do, the base is always going to be changing. And so every aspect of the digital revolution, the way that art is produced, the way it's consumed, the way it's sold, the way it's carried, every aspect of it changes every 6 months. Personally, I think one thing that's quite interesting is 10, 20, 30 years ago, record companies signed artists who looked and sounded like everything that was on the radio or on MTV. And they didn't care if the artist could play an instrument, they didn't care if the artist was smart, they didn't care if the artist had integrity or could play live. And now the audience is deciding what they want in musicians. And I think there's a real return to a musician standing on stage, pouring their heart out and connecting with an audience. And so I think that live music isn't necessarily growing to become this huge money-making industry where musicians are going to get rich from it, but I think a lot of musicians are now increasingly compelled to figure out how to stand on stage and connect with an audience. Whereas before, the connection was playing the one-hit single that the audience might have heard on the radio, and now the connection has to be a lot more genuine, and I think a lot more human in a way. It's interesting because almost everybody I meet in the world of art, music, literature, creative expression, everybody's equally excited and afraid. You know, no one really knows where their next paycheck is coming from, but they're really excited at their ability to create work and communicate directly with an audience. But, you know, one thing I did want to mention was one of the single most negative things about the digital revolution is negativity itself. You know, I think that, I mean, I don't go online and look at the world of comments anymore, but any artist, musician, writer who puts out a book or music or a record or a film, if they go online and read the reviews and the comments, they will never make another work as long as they live, because there's so much knee-jerk hatred and anger and vitriol out there. Like the moment someone puts out a book, 1 million people are going to go online and say how much they hate it, and then how much they hate the author. You know, like I stopped reading comment sections when I was on some website and someone had written a comment about me that if they saw me walking down the street, they would stab me to death and watch me bleed to death on the sidewalk. And I thought to myself, wow, I know myself relatively well. I'm a bald vegan guy who makes music in his apartment. Like, I don't know that I am really deserving of being stabbed to death by a complete stranger. But just that people are so comfortable with judging and hating and the anger. And I feel that to be, I know a lot of artists and musicians who now won't put out work because they don't want to be exposed to that level of hatred. I find that both spiritually and practically to be incredibly unhealthy, that there are so many people who spend hours a day indulging in judgment and hatred. And that as a species, that can't be good for us. You know, because when that's happened in the past, it's led to some pretty bad political movements. I was having a conversation about 6 or 7 years ago with Paul Frank, which I didn't actually know there was a Paul Frank. I thought it was like a made-up name, but there was actually a guy, Paul Frank. And he and I were talking, and he said something that was so smart. And to me, this is the future of creative expression. He said that when he started Paul Frank, they only had one idea, which was make stuff for your friends. You know, so that's, if I had one piece of advice for myself and for anybody, make stuff for your friends. Like, if you're a musician and you're making music and you don't like it and your friends don't like it, no one's going to like it. So focus on the simple, and it increases the chances that good things might follow.